Before the story begins, please note that it explores themes of family, humanity, and personal responsibility. This content is intended to encourage empathy and reflection. If you're not ready for these themes, please consider pausing before continuing. The storm wasn't just rain. It was a furious curtain of water that battered the asphalt of the back road as if the sky had a debt to settle with the earth. Frank, a 44-year-old man with hands weathered by hard labor and a face marked by the exhaustion of raising a daughter on his own, drove his old Ford pickup with the caution of someone who knows a breakdown would mean the end of his monthly budget. The windshield wipers squeaked in a hypnotic rhythm, fighting the downpour that turned the landscape into a blurry gray smear. Frank just wanted to get home, hug his little Claire, and forget that tomorrow might be his last day at the Southern Fabrics Mill, where rumors of layoffs had turned the workplace atmosphere into a preemptive funeral. However, something on the shoulder, a dark, rigid silhouette that defied the logic of such a terrible night, made him lift his foot off the gas and strain his eyes through the foggy glass. There he was, like a specter forgotten by time, an older man dressed in a gray suit that must have once been impeccable, but now clung to his thin frame like a second soaked skin. He wasn't hitchhiking. He wasn't raising his hand or looking for shelter under the nearby trees. He was simply walking with painful determination, clutching a brown leather briefcase against his chest with such force his knuckles must have been white. Frank estimated the man's age at 60-something, a dangerous age to be out in such elements. His conscience, shaped by years of hardship where help from others had been scarce, began to scream at him, "Don't stop! It's dangerous!" His city survival instinct whispered. But then he thought of his own father, who had passed away years ago, and the vulnerability radiating from that solitary figure. With a sigh of resignation that mixed fatigue and kindness, Frank flipped on the hazard lights and pulled the truck over, rolling down the passenger window just as thunder shook the ground. The old man stopped when he saw the pickup, but he didn't approach immediately. His eyes, beneath bushy gray brows, scrutinized Frank with a mix of mistrust and wounded dignity. It wasn't the look of a drifter, but that of a general who had lost his army. "Sir, get in, please! You're gonna freeze out there!" Frank shouted, competing with the roar of the wind. The man hesitated a second longer, looking at his briefcase as if it held state secrets, before nodding slightly. He opened the heavy door of the pickup and climbed in with difficulty, bringing with him the smell of ozone, wet earth, and damp wool. As the door closed, the silence of the cabin seemed to amplify the stranger's ragged breathing. Water dripped from his clothes, forming little puddles on the rubber floor mat, but he didn't seem to notice. His attention remained fixed on the briefcase in his lap, guarding it from an invisible enemy only he could see. "Thank you," the man murmured, in a hoarse but polite voice, a voice that denoted refinement and years of command, though now it sounded broken. Not many would stop on a night like this to pick up a soaked old man. Frank put the truck in gear, guiding it back onto the road with care. "I couldn't just leave you there, sir. This storm isn't for anyone, much less for walking down the old route." "My name is Frank." The old man brushed a lock of wet hair from his forehead and looked at the driver's profile. "Oliver. My name is Oliver." There was a dense silence, loaded with unasked questions. Frank noticed out of the corner of his eye that Oliver's hands were trembling, not just from the cold, but from a contained emotion that seemed heavier than the rain. "Where are you headed, Mr. Oliver?" "There's nothing for miles ahead, just the industrial zone and the old cemetery." Oliver looked out the window into the impenetrable darkness, as if searching for an answer in the night. "I'm going to the town of Sanford. I know it's far, but my car decided to give up about 5 miles back." The white lie was harmless but obvious. There hadn't been any broken-down cars in the last 10 miles Frank had just covered. However, the single father decided not to confront him. He knew what it was like to have to maintain your dignity when everything is falling apart. "Sanford is on my way, Mr. Oliver. I live right at the entrance, near the factory. I'll take you there, but first I'm going to crank up the heat. You're shaking like a leaf." Frank adjusted the controls, and hot air began to fill the cabin. Oliver closed his eyes for a moment, letting himself feel the warmth and a solitary tear, indistinguishable from the raindrops, rolled down his cheek. Before we continue with this journey that will change 2 lives, friends, we want to know what corner of the world you're joining us from tonight. Comment your city down below, and if you've ever helped a stranger on the road. The warmth of the truck began to thaw not just Oliver's body, but his tongue as well. "Do you work at the factory you mentioned? Southern Fabrics Mill?" asked the old man, caressing the gold clasp of his briefcase. Frank gripped the steering wheel tightly upon hearing the name. "Yeah, at least until tomorrow, or until the new owners decide we're not needed anymore. I've been there 15 years, since I was a kid, but they say they're going to automate the assembly line, and that the new manager, some guy named Mr. Landry, is coming with a sharp pair of scissors." The bitterness in Frank's voice was palpable. He spoke of his fear of not being able to pay for Claire's tutoring, of the mortgage that ate up half his salary, and the suffocating feeling he had every morning when clocking in, wondering if his badge would still work the next day. He didn't usually vent to strangers, but the night and the storm created a strange intimacy, almost like a confessional. Oliver listened with unusual attention, without interrupting, absorbing every detail of Frank's anguish. "Landry," repeated the old man, with an indecipherable tone, almost tasting the name in his mouth. "It's funny how decisions made in glass offices can destroy wooden kitchen tables, isn't it?" Frank nodded, surprised by the metaphor. "That's right, Mr. Oliver. They see numbers. We see lives. My daughter Claire's 10 years old. She doesn't understand profit margins. She just knows her dad comes home tired and sad. And I just want to give her a future where she doesn't have to depend on the mercy of people like Landry." Oliver turned his head and looked deeply at Frank. In his gray eyes, there was a spark of something that wasn't pity, but recognition. Kind of ancient fury that seemed to be waking from a long slumber. "Loyalty is a rare commodity these days, Frank," said Oliver, and for the first time, he let go of the briefcase with one hand to rub his aching knee. "You stopped for me. You could have just kept driving. You could have thought I was a madman or a thief. Why did you do it?" Frank shrugged, keeping his eyes on the headlights cutting through in the night. "Because no one should be alone in the middle of a storm, and because I want to believe that if I'm ever in that situation, someone would do the same for me. I guess you call it karma, or just decency." Oliver smiled, a sad and tired smile that briefly lit up his wrinkled face. Decency, a word that many in my world forgot decades ago. The old man looked back at his briefcase. "Do you know what I'm carrying in here, Frank? I'm carrying mistakes. 30 years of mistakes, and only one chance to fix them." The atmosphere in the pickup truck shifted. It wasn't just a rescue mission anymore. It felt like the prelude to something momentous. Frank was curious about the contents of the briefcase, but respect held him back from asking. "Mistakes, Mr. Oliver? We all have them. I should have studied more. I should have saved money when times were good. But the past is just smoke. What matters is getting you to Sandford so you can get dry." Oliver shook his head slowly. "No, Frank. Some mistakes don't just evaporate. They build up like rust in a machine until they stop it completely. I'm not going to Sandford to get dry, but to face a ghost. A ghost I created myself." The rain started to ease up a bit, turning into a persistent drizzle, while the town lights began to appear on the horizon like blurry fireflies. Upon reaching the entrance to Sandford, Oliver gave Frank directions that left him baffled. "Don't drop me in the center, son. Drop me in front of the factory's main entrance. I need to see it at night." Frank looked at him, puzzled. "To the factory? Mister?" "Oliver, it's closed, and the security guards don't let anyone in at this hour. Besides, it's still raining." But the old man insisted with a quiet authority that brooked no argument. "Just drop me at the gate. I have an old key. I need to check if it still works." Frank obeyed reluctantly, driving toward the huge industrial complex, which was the source of his livelihood and his nightmares. As he stopped the truck in front of the rusty bars under the yellowish light of the street lamps, Oliver stared at the Southern Fabrics Mill sign with a mixture of love and hate. Friends, Frank's intuition. tells him that something big is about to happen. If you believe fate brings people together for a reason, comment the keyword destiny to support this single dad. Oliver opened the truck door, letting in the deafening noise of the rain and the chill of the night once again. Before getting out, he turned to Frank and locked his gray eyes on the workers. "What time do you go in tomorrow, Frank?" he asked with a seriousness that didn't seem coincidental. "At 6 in the morning, Mr. Oliver, opening shift." If I still even have an access card," Frank replied with a nervous, bitter laugh. Oliver nodded slowly, memorizing the information. "At 6. Good, Frank. Listen to me closely. No matter what happens tomorrow, keep your head up. Dignity isn't up for negotiation, not even with hunger." Without waiting for a reply, the old man climbed out of the vehicle. His expensive leather shoes splashed through the mud, but he walked straight toward the security booth with his back stiff, ignoring the downpour like he was immune to the elements. Frank watched, fascinated and worried, foot hovering over the brake, ready to jump in if the guards tried to kick the old man out. From the safety of his cab, he watched as the night guard, a big young guy known for his bad temper, stepped out of the booth, flashlight in hand, ready to stop the intruder. Frank held his breath, expecting shouting or shoving. But what happened next completely threw him. Oliver didn't back down. He stopped right under the beam of the flashlight and said something Frank couldn't hear over the engine noise. Then the old man held his leather briefcase up to the light. The guard, who seconds ago looked like an attack dog, abruptly lowered his flashlight. His aggressive stance melted into total submission and confusion. There was a brief exchange of words, and to Frank's amazement, the guard unlocked the small pedestrian gate. Oliver turned one last time toward the truck, raised his hand in a wave, and disappeared into the darkness of the industrial complex. Frank sat there for another minute, trying to process what he'd just seen before driving off toward home. The final drive to his small brick ranch house was silent, but Frank's mind was a whirlwind. Who was that man, really? A nostalgic former employee? A surprise inspector? Or just a lucky old crazy guy? When he got home, reality hit him hard. The lights were on. Claire was waiting for him. Walking in, the smell of reheated soup welcomed him like a warm hug. Claire, with her messy pigtails and teddy bear pajamas, ran into his arms. "Daddy, you're late. I was scared of the storm." Frank scooped her up, burying his face in her neck to hide his own anguish. "It was just traffic and rain, sweetheart. Daddy's here. I'm always going to be here." That promise, spoken with such conviction, weighed a ton on his conscience. He knew that without work, being there meant watching her go without. And that thought was a knife in his gut. That night, Frank barely slept. He sat at the kitchen table, going over the piled-up bills under the dim light of an energy-saving bulb. The mortgage, electricity, gas, school books, the numbers didn't lie, and they had no mercy. If they fired him tomorrow, he'd have severance for 2 months. Maybe 3 if he stretched every cent by eating ramen. And then? He was 44 years old, with a back injured from carrying rolls of fabric. The job market wasn't kind to men like him. He looked out the window in the direction of the factory. The rain had stopped, leaving a deathly silence in the working-class neighborhood. He remembered Oliver's words. Dignity isn't up for negotiation. Frank clenched his fists. He decided if he was going down, he'd go down fighting. He wouldn't let Landry, that tyrant manager, see him defeated. He ironed his uniform with care, like it was armor for the final battle. Morning arrived with a lead-gray sky, reflecting the mood of the hundreds of workers crossing the gate at Southern Fabrics Mill. The mood in the locker room was like a funeral. No one was joking around. No one was talking about Sunday's baseball game. Just nervous whispers and shifty glances. "They say the list is already printed," whispered Ramirez, a guy from the dye line. "They say they're going to fire 40% of the staff today." Frank slammed his locker shut. "Let them say whatever they want. We keep working until they tell us to stop." But when they got to the production floor, they noticed something weird. The machines were off. The usual roar of the mechanical looms was gone. In its place stood a makeshift stage in the center of the warehouse, with a microphone and several men in suits talking amongst themselves. Standing out among them was Mr. Landry, with his shark-like grin and a gold watch that cost more than Frank's annual salary. "Attention, everyone!" Landry's voice boomed over the speakers, screechy and unpleasant. "Leave your stations and come to the center. We have important announcements regarding the company's operational restructuring." The workers shuffled toward the center like cattle to the slaughterhouse. Frank stood at the edge of the group with his arms crossed, feeling the bile rise in his throat. Landry grabbed the microphone, visibly enjoying the fear radiating from the crowd. "As you know, the market has changed. For Southern Fabrics Mill to survive, we must trim the fat. We must be efficient. And unfortunately, efficiency requires sacrifices." He started talking about margins, automation, the future. Empty words to justify the hunger of the families standing there. Frank looked for a sign of hope, but he only saw resignation on his friends' faces. Here, we take a dramatic pause. Workplace injustice is a wound that many carry in silence. If you believe workers deserve respect and shouldn't be treated like numbers, type the word justice in the comments. Landry pulled a white envelope from his jacket. The silence on the floor was absolute. You couldn't even hear a breath. "I have here the names of those who will continue with us in this new phase. If you don't hear your name, please stop by HR to collect your severance and turn in your badges." He began to read. The list was short. Too short. Frank listened with his heart hammering against his ribs. He went through A, B, C, names of young kids, new hires who were paid less, the veterans, the ones who had given their health for the company, were being systematically ignored. When he got to the F's, Landry read Fernandez Luis and skipped to the next one. Frank felt the ground disappear beneath his feet. He hadn't said his name. He was out. 15 years of loyalty, erased in a second by a man who had never dirtied his hands with machine grease. The reading ended. More than half the staff was fired. You could start to hear the stifled sobbing of some co-workers. Landry smiled, closing the folder. "To those staying, congratulations. To those leaving, thank you for your services. Security will escort you to the exit to ensure there are no incidents." It was at that precise moment, when despair was about to turn into collective fury, that a loud metallic clang echoed from the upper walkway overlooking the plant. Everyone, including Landry, looked up. Up there, leaning against the rusty iron railing, was a figure Frank recognized instantly, even though he looked different. He wasn't the soaked, fragile old man from the night before anymore. In a dry, immaculate suit and with a posture of absolute authority, Oliver watched the scene like a supreme judge. "Mr. Landry," Oliver's voice, amplified by the warehouse acoustics, crashed down on them like thunder. No microphone needed. Landry narrowed his eyes, annoyed by the interruption. "Who the hell are you? How did you get in there? Security! Get that old man out of here!" But the security guards didn't move. They were staring at Oliver with pale faces. Oliver started walking down the metal stairs, slowly, every step ringing out with an ominous echo. The brown leather briefcase was still in his hand. "I don't think security is going to remove me, Landry, especially since their checks are signed with my money." A murmur of confusion rippled through the crowd. Landry let out a nervous laugh. "Your money? Your delusional Gramps? This factory belongs to the Omega Investment Group." Oliver reached the factory floor, and the crowd instinctively parted to let him pass as he walked toward the podium. Oliver stepped up onto the platform and stood in front of Landry, who, despite being younger and taller, seemed to shrink in the old man's presence. Oliver placed the leather briefcase on the table and opened it with a sharp click. He pulled out an old yellow document and a stack of new papers with official seals. "You're right, Landry. It does belong to the Omega Group. And I am Oliver Vance, founder, majority partner, and as of 8 a.m. this morning, the sole owner. I bought out my cowardly partners who let you ruin my legacy." The name Vance hit the older workers like a lightning bolt. It was the name on the foundation plaque from 1970, the name of the man who had built the factory with his own hands and disappeared after his wife died decades ago. Landry turned pale, taking a step back, bumping into the microphone. which let out a sharp screech of feedback. The silence on the floor was so deep that the hum of the fluorescent lights seemed deafening. Landry, his face drenched in cold sweat, tried to stammer out a defense, but Oliver raised a hand, silencing him with a gesture of absolute disdain. "Save your breath, Landry. I've spent the last 2 weeks auditing your accounts from the shadows. I know about the diverted funds. I know about the bribes to suppliers. And worst of all, I know how you've treated the people who built this company." Oliver grabbed the list of layoffs that Landry had read so coldly and held it up high for everyone to see. "You see red numbers and efficiency charts. I see families. I see loyalty. You were going to fire the very foundation of this place just so you could buy another sports car." With a slow, deliberate movement, Oliver ripped the list in half, then tore it again, letting the pieces fall like confetti onto the concrete floor. The crowd of workers, still in shock, began to understand what was happening. A murmur of hope started to swell like a wave. Oliver stepped up to the edge of the platform, scanning the sea of hundreds of grimy, exhausted faces, until he spotted Frank. "Where is Frank?" he asked, his voice booming across the crowd. Taken by surprise, Frank's co-workers quickly stepped aside, leaving him standing alone in an empty circle, exposed to everyone's gaze. Frank felt his legs shaking beneath him, not from fear, but from the sheer intensity of the moment. Oliver smiled. It was that same sad yet warm smile from the night before. "Come up here, Frank. Please." Frank hesitated, glancing around, but the gentle nudges from his friends encouraged him to move. He walked toward the platform with his head down, feeling so small in such a big moment, while Landry glared at him with pure hatred, unable to understand what kind of connection a lowly worker could possibly have with the owner. When Frank got up on the platform, Oliver didn't shake his hand like a subordinate. He hugged him like a long-lost brother. The contrast was striking. The owner in his impeccable suit and the worker in his uniform stained with grease and dye. Oliver turned toward the microphone, resting a hand on Frank's shoulder. "My car didn't break down last night," Oliver confessed to the stunned crowd. "Last night, I walked here, through the worst storm of the year, walking along the old road. I wanted to know if there was any humanity left in this town before I decided whether or not to close the factory. Hundreds of cars passed me by. Trucks from this very company splashed me with mud and kept right on going. Even you, Landry. You drove past in your German sedan and didn't even tap the brakes." Landry opened his mouth in outrage, but Oliver's glare silenced him instantly. But this man who had every reason to be bitter and selfish, he stopped. Oliver went on with his story, painting the scene of the previous night with words that touched the heart of every worker there. He spoke about the warmth inside the truck, about Frank's genuine concern, and above all, how Frank spoke of the factory not with hate, but with sadness at the thought of losing his home away from home. "Frank didn't know who I was. He didn't know that I was the one who could save his job. He helped me because he has a noble heart, and a company run without nobility is destined for moral bankruptcy." Oliver turned toward Landry, his expression hardening like steel. "You, Landry, represent everything I want to wipe from my legacy. You're fired, and you won't get a cent of severance because my lawyers will be addressing your accounting errors in court. Security, escort the former manager off my property." The guards, who had also suffered under Landry's arrogance, obeyed with speed and barely disguised pleasure. Seeing Landry being dragged out of the factory triggered an explosion of applause and cheers that shook the windows. Men and women wept openly, hugging one another. The dark cloud of unemployment had vanished in an instant. Frank, still up on the platform, looked at Oliver with tears in his eyes. "Thank you, Mr. Oliver. Thank you for saving us," he whispered. Oliver shook his head. "No, Frank, thank you. You were the one who saved this factory last night. If you hadn't stopped for me, I would have signed the sale papers this very day, and everyone would be out on the street." Oliver raised his hands, asking for silence again. "Starting today, there will be no mass layoffs. We are going to modernize, yes, but with training for everyone. And I need someone I can trust to be my direct link to the plant. Someone who won't lie to me. someone who understands that numbers represent people. Then Oliver turned to the crowd. "Frank," he announced, "I'm offering you the position of General Plant Supervisor. I want you to be my eyes and ears here. I want you to make sure that no decision made from a desk ever destroys a kitchen table." Frank was left breathless. Supervisor. That meant a salary that wouldn't just pay off the debts, but would secure Claire's college education. But, Mr. Oliver, I only know how to fix looms and load boxes. I don't know anything about management." Oliver smiled. "Management is learned in courses the company will pay for. Decency, Frank. That isn't taught. You either have it or you don't. Accept it." Frank looked down at his colleagues who were nodding and giving thumbs up in support. He thought of Claire, of her sweet face when she heard the news. "I accept, Mr. Oliver. I won't let you down." The handshake that sealed the deal was photographed by dozens of cell phones and would become the legend of Sanford. The workday resumed, but with a completely different energy. The fear had transformed into gratitude and commitment. Oliver spent the rest of the morning in the management office, which was now being cleared of Landry's belongings, reviewing documents with Frank by his side. The old man taught him patiently, explaining the blueprints and the real challenges the company faced. However, Frank noticed something worrying. Every time Oliver thought no one was looking, he put his hand to his chest and grimaced in pain. His skin, in the daylight, had a grayish tone that the makeup of enthusiasm couldn't quite hide. At noon, when they were sharing a coffee, Frank dared to ask, "Are you feeling okay, boss? You look pale. Do you want me to call a doctor?" Oliver set down his coffee cup with a trembling hand. He sighed deeply, looking out the large window toward the factory courtyard. "I'm not going to lie to you, Frank. My time is limited. I have a heart condition that the doctors say is a ticking time bomb. That's why I came back. I don't have children. Or at least, I don't have children who speak to me." The revelation fell heavy in the office. Frank remembered the mention of mistakes in the truck. "Estranged family?" he asked softly. Oliver nodded with sadness. "A son. He left 20 years ago. We fought over control of the company, over my stubbornness, over my obsession with work, the same obsession that almost destroyed this place. I told him I never wanted to see him again if he walked out that door, and he kept his word. I don't know where he is or if he's even alive. Recovering the factory is my attempt to clean house before I go, just in case he decides to come back one day." Oliver's vulnerability struck a chord with Frank. He who lived for his daughter couldn't imagine the pain of a father who had driven away his own son. "It's never too late to look for him, Mr. Oliver. If you could forgive this factory for losing its way, your son will be able to forgive you. Pride doesn't keep you warm when it's cold." Oliver looked at Frank with a mix of admiration and envy. "You have a simple wisdom, Frank, that is worth more than all my degrees. You might be right, but first I gotta make sure this ship doesn't sink. And for that, I need you strong. The lawyers are coming tomorrow to make your new contract and the bylaw changes official. I want to shield the employees before my health gives out for good." It was a race against time, and they both knew it. That afternoon, leaving the factory, Frank didn't feel like the defeated man he was yesterday. He walked toward his old Ford truck with his head held high, waving to the co-workers who were now looking at him with respect and hope. However, when he got to the parking lot, he saw something that made his blood run cold. Right next to his truck was Landry's luxury sports car. The former manager was leaning on the hood of Frank's Ford, smoking a cigarette with a look of manic hatred. There were no guards nearby in that part of the parking lot. Landry threw the cigarette on the ground and crushed it hard. "Enjoy your moment of glory, garbage boy," Landry spat, walking toward Frank threateningly. "You think you've won just because that senile old man gave you a pat on the back, but you have no idea who you've messed with. That factory has hidden debts that not even Oliver knows about, and I've got the documents that can sink you all and send you to prison." Frank held Landry's gaze, feeling his initial fear turn into a cold, determined calm. He remembered Oliver's words about dignity. He wasn't going to let this man, who had played with the livelihoods of hundreds of families, intimidate him on his own turf. "You might have documents, Landry, and you might have poison on your tongue," Frank replied, taking a step forward, forcing the former manager to step back instinctively. But Oliver has something you'll never have: the people's loyalty. If you try to sink this factory, you won't just be facing Oliver and his lawyers. You'll be facing 300 workers who have nothing to lose. So get in your expensive car and get the hell out of here before someone else sees you threatening an employee. Landry, surprised by Frank's quiet ferocity, let out a nervous laugh, spat on the ground, and got into his vehicle, peeling out with a screech of tires that sounded like a declaration of war. On the way home, the euphoria of the promotion mixed with worry about the threat. Frank tried to put on a smile before opening the door. Claire ran to greet him, noticing immediately that her father was walking taller, without the weight of the world on his shoulders. "Dad, what happened? Did they fire you?" she asked with the premature anxiety of children growing up in hardship. Frank knelt down and looked her in the eyes. "No, my love, quite the opposite. Daddy's the new boss." "Well, one of the bosses. We're gonna be okay, Claire. You won't have to worry about school field trips anymore." The little girl squealed with joy and hugged him. But Frank, while stroking her hair, looked out the window into the darkness of the street, wondering what cards Landry was keeping up his sleeve, and if Oliver had the physical strength to withstand another blow. That night, they had barbecue, ribs to celebrate. But the taste in Frank's mouth was bittersweet. The next morning, Frank arrived at the factory and, an hour early, finding Oliver already at his desk, surrounded by folders and empty coffee cups. The old man had dark circles under his eyes, deep, and his skin looked waxy. Frank closed the office door and told him every single detail about the run-in with Landry in the parking lot. Oliver listened unblinking, drumming his fingers on the table. "Secret debts," Oliver muttered. "I knew Landry was a crook, but I never thought he'd be stupid enough to borrow from outside lenders in the company's name." "If that's true, Frank, the factory's assets could be seized before we can even react." Oliver stood up, but a sudden dizzy spell forced him to grab onto the back of his chair. Frank rushed to his side. "Sit down, Mr. Oliver. You can't go on like this. You need to rest. Let the lawyers handle it." "There's no time to rest, son," Oliver wheezed, struggling to catch his breath. "If Landry leaks those documents to the banks or the press today, our credit will be frozen and we won't be able to make payroll next week. We have to find those papers ourselves before he uses them." They spent the next 6 hours in a forensic auditing frenzy, going through boxes of files that Landry hadn't had time to destroy. Frank, guided by Oliver's experience, learned how to read balance sheets and spot irregularities. They worked side by side, the millionaire owner and the former factory worker, united by a common cause. In that shared silence of work, a mutual respect was forged that went beyond social class. Friends of tales of kindness. The betrayal of a colleague hurts, but the loyalty of a new friend heals. Have you ever found out that someone you trusted was betraying you? Comment the word loyalty if you value honesty above all else. Around 3 in the afternoon, they found what they were looking for. Hidden in a mislabeled folder marked as preventive maintenance, they found a series of IOUs signed by Landry, using the factory's machinery as collateral for unauthorized, high-risk loans. The amount was astronomical. Oliver went pale when he saw the final number. "My God, this scoundrel mortgaged the very heart of the factory," he whispered. The sheer scale of the disaster caused Oliver's heart to give out. He clutched his chest, letting out a choked gasp, and slumped onto the desk, knocking the papers to the floor. "Mr. Oliver!" Frank yelled, catching him before he fell out of his chair. The old man was struggling to breathe, his lips turning blue. Frank reached for the phone to call an ambulance, but Oliver grabbed his wrist with surprising strength. No hospitals. If word gets out that I'm dying, the stocks will tank, and the bank will call in the debt. Today, Frank found himself at a terrible crossroads. Oliver's life hung by a thread, but taking him to the local public hospital would be news in minutes, and getting him to a private clinic in the city would take too long. "I'm not letting you die here, boss," Frank said with determination. "I'm taking you to my place. It's 5 minutes away. My neighbor was a military nurse. She'll know what to do without alerting anyone, and you're going to rest whether you like it or not." Oliver tried to protest, but he had no strength left. Frank practically carried him to his truck, covering him with a blanket so no one would see the owner of Southern Fabrics Mill in that state. He drove with his heart in his throat, praying the old man would hold on. When they arrived at his humble neighborhood, they were completely discreet. They went in through the back door, and Frank laid Oliver down in his own bed, the only one in the house with a decent mattress. The neighbor, Donna Martha, came right over when Frank called. She was a woman of few words and a lot of action. She checked Oliver's pulse, gave him a pill to put under his tongue that she kept for emergencies, and ordered him to rest completely. "It's angina, aggravated by stress," Martha declared quietly in the kitchen. "He needs calm, Frank. If he gets upset again, he won't survive the next one." Frank nodded gratefully. Claire got home from school a little later and found the strange scene. The owner of the factory sleeping in her dad's bed. Frank explained the situation to her gently. "He's a friend, Claire. A very important friend who needs us to take care of him. We have to be quiet and make him some good soup." The little girl, with her natural innocence, nodded solemnly, taking on her role as an improvised nurse with touching seriousness. Oliver woke up at dusk. He felt weak, but the crushing pain in his chest had gone down. The first thing he saw wasn't a nurse in white or a sterile hospital ceiling, but a wall with damp patches painted over in blue and children's drawings stuck up with tape. He turned his head and saw Claire sitting on a wooden chair, watching him with big, curious eyes. "Hi," the little girl said softly. "My dad made vegetable soup. Do you want some?" Oliver tried to sit up, and Claire ran to put a pillow behind his back. That simple action, that selfless care from a little girl who didn't even know him, cracked the old man's armor. It painfully reminded him of his late wife, who always took care of him with that same tenderness. "Yes, please, little one. I would love some," Oliver replied with a cracking voice, feeling that in this poor house there was more wealth than in his entire empty mansion. Frank came in with a tray of steaming soup. Seeing his daughter and his boss talking filled his chest with an indescribable emotion. Oliver ate slowly, savoring every spoonful as if it were a delicacy. "Frank," Oliver said after finishing, "you have a treasure here. This little girl, she's worth more than all the stocks in the market." Frank smiled, stroking Claire's head. "I know, Mr. Oliver. She keeps me going." Oliver stared into space with glassy eyes. "My son's name was Gavin. He was the same age as Claire when I started ignoring him for work. I thought I was building an empire for him. But really, I was building a wall between us. When he wanted to study music instead of business, I kicked him out. I told him he wasn't worthy of my last name. How stupid I was, Frank. How stupid and arrogant." The moment of confession was interrupted by the shrill sound of Oliver's cell phone, which was in the pocket of his jacket hanging on the chair. Frank reached for it. The screen showed "private number." Oliver gestured for Frank to answer and put it on speaker. "Oliver." Landry's voice sounded distorted and mocking. "I guess you're looking for the promissory notes. Well, I've got news for you. It doesn't matter if you find them anymore. I just sent digital copies to the central bank and the local newspaper. Tomorrow morning, Southern Fabrics Mill and your assets will be frozen. Enjoy your last night as a millionaire, old man. You've lost." The call cut out. The silence in that small room was absolute. Frank looked at Oliver, expecting to see defeat, but what he saw in the old man's eyes was a spark of fresh fury. "Frank, hand me my briefcase," Oliver ordered, struggling to sit up. "If he wants a war, I'll give him a war. But I need your help for one last, desperate play. There's more than just old papers in this briefcase, Frank," Oliver said, his voice weak but firm, while his shaking fingers punched a code into a small banking security device he'd pulled from a hidden compartment. "I have a personal emergency fund. Money I put aside decades ago, far away from the company books. I was thinking of leaving. Something for Gavin, if he ever came back. Landry doesn't know it exists. It's enough to cover the debt and recapitalize the factory. But I need to do the transfer right now, before the banks open and freeze the corporate accounts." Frank ran to get his old laptop. The internet connection was slow, and the tension in the room was suffocating. As the loading bar crawled forward agonizingly, Oliver looked at Frank. "If I do this, I'm left with nothing personally. If the factory fails, I'll die in ruin, but I'd rather die poor and with dignity than rich and a traitor to my people." The transfer went through at 3:45 a.m. M. Oliver let out a long sigh and collapsed back onto the pillows, completely drained. His skin color was alarming. "It's done," he whispered. "Landry is in for a surprise." Frank shut the laptop and took the old man's hand. "Okay, Mr. Oliver, we're going to the hospital. No more excuses about shares or banks. Your life is the only thing that matters now." This time, Oliver didn't fight back. He knew his body had reached its limit. Frank woke Claire up, wrapped her in a blanket, and the three of them got into the truck. The drive to the hospital was silent. Oliver watched Claire sleeping in the back seat with infinite tenderness, maybe imagining what his own grandkids would have been like if he hadn't been so stubborn. When they got to the ER, the doctors moved fast. Oliver was admitted to the coronary unit, and Frank stayed in the waiting room, praying to a God he sometimes doubted, asking for just one more miracle. The next morning, Southern Fabrics Mill was like a scene from a movie. Landry arrived at 8 a.m. with a team of lawyers and 2 bank auditors, ready to shut it down and strip the company for parts. The workers, led by the loyal foreman, were blocking the entrance in a silent strike. Landry sneered at them. "Stand aside. This is over. The company is insolvent." But then an official black car pulled up. It wasn't the police there to clear out the workers. It was the bank's regional compliance director. He stepped out, adjusting his glasses, and walked right up to Landry. "Mr. Landry, we received a capital injection at 4 a.m. that covers the entire guaranteed debt and leaves an operating surplus. The company is solvent. However," the banker paused, looking at the documents Frank and Oliver had sent. "We have evidence of fraud in the loan application. The police are on their way for you, not for them." Landry was handcuffed in front of the 300 employees he'd tried to destroy. His shouted threats were drowned out by the roar of applause. Frank wasn't there to see it happen. He was still back at the hospital, holding on to Oliver's hand as the old man grew weaker and weaker. When he broke the news, the old man just smiled a little, his eyes staying closed. "Justice," he whispered. "Now, I can finally rest." But Oliver had one last mission left. Summoning every ounce of strength, he pointed to his briefcase on the chair nearby. "Open it, Frank. There's a blue envelope at the bottom." Frank did as he was asked. The envelope had a name scrawled across it in shaky handwriting. "Gavin Vance. I found him a year ago," Oliver confessed. "He's living in the capital. He's a music teacher. I never had the courage to go see him. Please, give this to him. Tell him I'm not asking for forgiveness. I just want him to know that I loved him, right until the very end." Oliver Vance passed away that same afternoon, just as the sun started to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and violet. He died peacefully, holding the hand of a man he'd met barely 48 hours ago, but who had become his true family. The news of his death shook the whole town of Sanford. The funeral was packed. There weren't any expensive bouquets from hypocritical businessmen. Instead, there were thousands of wildflowers, brought by the workers and their kids. Frank, wearing his only black suit, felt like an orphan all over again. But he had a promise to keep. The next day, he left Claire with a neighbor and drove his pickup truck toward the Capitol, the blue envelope sitting right there on the passenger seat. It was a long drive filled with thoughts about how life can flip in a split second, how a storm can bring a shipwreck or a treasure. He found Gavin at a small music conservatory. He was a 40-year-old man with Oliver's same gray eyes, though his gaze was softened by a life of art. When Frank introduced himself and handed over the envelope, Gavin stiffened up. "Oliver? I haven't heard from him in 20 years. Frank told him the whole story. The rain, the factory, the sickness, and the final regret. Gavin opened the letter and read it in silence. There weren't any checks or legal wills in that envelope, just a 3-page letter where a father laid his soul bare, apologizing for choosing money over love. Gavin wept, silent tears that washed away years of resentment. "I always thought he hated me," Gavin said. "I thought I was just a disappointment to him." Frank shook his head. "You were his greatest pride, Gavin. He just didn't know how to tell you that until he ran out of time. Weeks later, the official will was read. Oliver had left the factory ownership to his son Gavin, but with a condition: lifetime management and rights for Frank. Gavin, who didn't have any interest in leaving his music to manage looms, made a decision that surprised everyone. "My father built these walls, but you all built the soul of this factory," Gavin told the assembly of workers. "I'm keeping 49% of the shares as a silent partner. The remaining 51% will be divided between Frank and an employee cooperative. Frank will be the new CEO. My father trusted him when no one else would, and I trust my father's decision." The applause was deafening. Frank, the single dad who was terrified of losing his job, now had the responsibility of guiding everyone's future. Frank took on the role, not with arrogance, but with the humility of a man who knows exactly how much a screw weighs. And his office door was always open. Oliver's photo hung behind his desk, reminding him every day that dignity isn't for sale. Claire was able to go to college later, but she never forgot the night a stranger slept in her dad's bed. The Southern Fabrics Mill thrived under its new, humane management, becoming proof that profit and people don't have to be enemies. And every time it rained hard, Frank would stop his car, now a little newer but just as humble, to see if anyone on the road needed help. He knew that angels sometimes come disguised as soaked beggars, and that a simple act of kindness can rewrite history. The life of Frank teaches us that we aren't defined by our circumstances, but by how we react to them. He could have just kept driving that rainy night to keep himself safe, and no one would have blamed him. But he chose to stop. He chose to open his door, and in doing so, he opened the door to his own destiny. Oliver found redemption, Gavin found peace, and Frank found a purpose. Sometimes we feel alone in the storm, thinking no one is coming to save us, without realizing that we have the power to be someone else's rescue. True wealth wasn't found inside Oliver's leather briefcase, but in Frank's decision to share his heater with a stranger. Thanks for joining us on this journey of humanity, loyalty, and second chances. We hope the story of Frank and Oliver inspired you to look at strangers with a little more empathy. You never know what battles the person walking in the rain is fighting, or what gift is hidden within their pain. If this story moved you, we ask for one last gesture. Type the word solidarity in the comments and share this video with someone who needs. A reminder that good deeds always come back multiplied. Subscribe for more stories that touch the soul. See you on the next journey.